Well, the book is called Traveling Black: A Story of Race and Resistance, and it is a history of segregation and discrimination on various kinds of transportation, from stagecoaches and steamships to trains, cars, and airplanes. And it is sort of it's about the experience of traveling black and what kinds of discrimination black people encountered, and also how people resisted discrimination. It ends up arguing that that transportation is really central to the civil rights movement, and there's almost a sort of continuous struggle for civil rights on transportation among African Americans starting in the 19th century that goes right through to the 1960s. No, I think it's fundamental to the civil rights movement because travel segregation is sort of central to the kind of society that emerges in the post-Reconstruction South. I mean, white supremacy starts with things like separate car laws that relegated blacks into Jim Crow cars. We sometimes forget that Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the famous dictum that was overturned in Brown, but it comes out of an 1896 railroad case. And it was a case in which Louisiana blacks were challenging Louisiana's separate car law. And the issue was important because the so-called separate cars on the railroad weren't just separate; they were, as separate schools would be. Also, they were manifestly inferior, and had and sort of deeply uncomfortable and made traveling difficult. And it was something that everyone experienced. And it was also a badge of humiliation to have to ride in those Jim Crow cars. So all of those things made the issue of transportation a kind of cross-class issue. Cross-class issue. Everyone hated the Jim Crow car, and it was exploitative and dangerous. At about the same time that they sort of made Jim Crow cars universal across the South, the railroad commissions began standardizing fares, so you actually paid, like, there were no second class fares anymore, so you paid the same fare if you rode Jim Crow, if you didn't ride Jim Crow. So even though the Jim Crow car might not even have a bathroom, it might be used for livestock or prisoners, you would still be paying the same amount of money to travel in it. Ida B. Wells, I wrote a biography of Ida B. Wells, who was a anti-lynching activist and a journalist, and her career really got its start when she was kicked out of a ladies' car in Tennessee in the early 1880s. This was before Plessy versus Ferguson, before the separate car laws, but it was a time when many railroads had set aside the best car on the train for ladies. It would be a car riding at the end of the train. It would be a little more comfortable than the others. It was safer in an era when trains still crashed a lot. And by the 1880s, black women were increasingly unwelcome in these ladies' cars. And she sued and she won, as did a number of black women during that time period. In the case of Ida B. Wells, she lost in the state Supreme Court. But for me, this case exposed the kind of dilemma that all the dilemmas of sort of race and gender for Ida B. Wells, that sort of got her thinking about how Southern chivalry did not apply to black women, like the idea that women were treated as a special class in the South did not apply to black women. And it also got me thinking about how, segregation had to be invented in very specific ways. Like you had, people sometimes talked about it as a natural outgrowth of slavery, but it required laws and decisions and arrangements, which then would actually vary from one form of transportation to another. And that's what kind of got me going. I became interested in well, how did buses get segregated? Was there segregation on airplanes? The book started as a series of questions about those things. Yeah, it's part of the structure, absolutely. And it's, it required all kinds of entities to support it. I mean, you know, it had to get support from the judiciary and Plessy versus, the federal judiciary, from the state judiciary. It also had to have the federal government turn a blind eye to certain things. And it did become structural. Because southern states is where you have the laws. It's, where railroads, restaurants, and the like literally have to segregate. But in the North, there's a lot of informal segregation, and there's also things that really surprised me, like the fact that blacks were sometimes put in the Jim Crow car as far west as Los Angeles or Chicago. They often started out in the Jim Crow section or the back of the bus, in New York, on their way south because of this sort of like nobody wanted to transfer them. So there was a lot of ways in which in the North there would be either informal segregation or accommodations to the segregation that existed in the South, which meant that you could often encounter Jim Crow in the North, but you could never be quite sure when and where you would encounter it. I don't know. That's actually really hard. It's a hard question. I always say nobody ever, when you ask kids what they're going to do, nobody ever says, I want to be a historian. It just never happens. And I mean, I always liked history. I did a combined major in history and English in college. I think I got interested in American history in particular, and African American history, because my family, even though I'm from the U.S. originally, as was my mother, we lived mostly outside the U.S. We lived in Canada a lot. We lived in Norway a bit. So I was curious about the United States and, the history of the United States, and just became more so over time. And then at a certain point, I think as I sort of grew up and began thinking about the world seriously, I also really, I started to think, even though I still love English and fiction and stuff, that history is so important. It's like a subject I could imagine teaching, because I actually do believe that everyone should know it, whether they want to or not. Well, that's been interesting. I feel like the last crazy couple of years with the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, this sort of tumultuous politics, students are more concerned about history than they've ever been previously. They sort of want to know how our society came to be the way it is. They want to know how previous generations of young people have created social change or addressed issues. So I think there have been various points when a lot of students have mostly seemed like they're sort of concerned about getting a well-paying job and sort of like not that interested in history. But I think right now people are really concerned about the state of the world, especially young people.